The scent of rain and rejection clung to the air, a familiar perfume Seraphina had worn her entire life. It was the smell of the Omega dens, of damp earth and whispered insults. Today it was laced with the cloying sweetness of the ceremonial moon blossoms, a floral mockery of the grim proceedings. She stood before the pack Alpha, her head bowed not in deference, but to hide the tremor in her chin. Her dress, a castoff from her sister, was a pale gray, the color of ash and insignificance. "She is all we have to offer, Lord Regent," Alpha Marcus said, his voice a low rumble of apology. He gestured a dismissive hand toward Seraphina. "Our pack is small, our resources strained. She is of little use here." The words were stones, each one striking a bruise she already carried. Of little use. It was the story of her 19 years. Born an Omega in a pack that prized strength, she was a disappointment. Worse, her wolf had never surfaced. She was a shifter who could not shift, a hollow shell where a proud beast should have resided. Her only notable trait was a strange, quiet warmth in her hands, an ability to soothe aches and fevers with a simple touch, but even that was viewed with suspicion. A weak, wolfless Omega with witch-like hands, a bad omen. Lord Cassian, the Alpha King's regent, surveyed her from his position on the raised dais. He was a wolf of immense presence, all sharp angles and polished silver armor that reflected the flickering torchlight. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were cold and assessing. He was not looking at a person. He was inspecting livestock. "The tribute is not for me," he stated, his voice devoid of warmth. "It is for the beast of the crags, a sworn guardian of the northern pass, by the king's own decree. He requires a companion, a keeper for his domain." A collective shudder rippled through the assembled pack members. The beast of the crags. Even his name was a curse whispered in the dark, a monstrous wolf, scarred and savage, who lived in solitude in the crumbling Blackwood keep. Legends claimed he'd torn apart a dozen warriors sent to subdue him, that his howl could curdle milk and stop a man's heart. Sending a tribute to him was a death sentence, and they had chosen her. Of course they had. Her father wouldn't meet her eyes. He stood beside her mother and sister Rosalind, whose perfect, shimmering silver wolf was the pride of their family. Rosalind's expression was a mixture of pity and relief. Pity for Seraphina, relief that it wasn't her. It was always a relief for everyone that the misfortune fell on Seraphina. "She will suffice," Lord Cassian declared, sealing her fate with 3 words. He cared not for her quality, only that the tribute was paid. It was a political necessity, a box to be ticked. "Have her ready by dawn. My guards will escort her." There were no protests, no cries of injustice, just the silent, collective exhalation of a pack ridding itself of a burden. Seraphina felt a cold hollowness spread through her chest, an emptiness so vast it threatened to swallow the fear. They were not just sending her away, they were erasing her. That night, her room felt like a tomb. She packed nothing, for she owned nothing of value. Rosalind entered silently, placing a small, worn wooden songbird on her bedside table. It was a toy from their childhood. "I'm sorry, Sarah," she whispered, her voice tight. I wish it were different." "Do you?" Seraphina's voice was rough, unused. She rarely spoke, having learned long ago that her words held no weight. "Or do you wish I were different? Stronger? A proper wolf? Like you?" Rosalind flinched. "That's not fair." "No," Seraphina agreed, her gaze fixed on the cracked ceiling. "It's not. But it's the truth." She felt a familiar ache behind her eyes, the sting of unshed tears. Crying was a luxury, a sign of weakness she could not afford to show. She had to conserve what little strength she had left. Her only gift, the strange warmth in her hands, felt like a cruel joke. It could soothe the teething pains of pups and ease the stiffness in an elder's joints, but it couldn't heal the one thing that was truly broken: herself. It couldn't mend the fault line that ran through her soul, the place where her wolf was supposed to be. As the first gray light of dawn bled through her window, 2 guards in the regent's black and silver livery appeared at her door. They did not speak to her, merely gestured for her to follow. She walked through the silent packed grounds, a ghost leaving a place she had never truly inhabited. No one came to say goodbye. She was placed in a small windowless carriage. The journey was long and jarring, the road growing rougher as they climbed into the desolate northern mountains. The air grew colder, smelling of pine and wet stone. Fear, a cold and living thing, began to coil in her stomach. The stories about the beast were terrifying, but the reality of being delivered to him, a piece of meat for a monster, was a horror beyond imagination. What would he do to her? The regent had said he needed a keeper. What did a monster's keep need keeping? Would he devour her? Tear her apart? Or was there a fate even worse waiting in the shadows of that dark fortress? Desperation was a bitter taste in her mouth. For a fleeting, wild moment, she considered trying to escape, to run into the woods and take her chances with the wilderness. But she was wolfless. She wouldn't last a night. At least in the keep, her death might be quick. The carriage finally jolted to a halt. The door was opened, and the cold mountain air rushed in, stealing her breath. Before her stood Blackwood Keep. It was less a castle and more a wound in the mountainside, a jagged silhouette of broken towers and crumbling walls against a bruised purple sky. It looked like it had been clawed from the rock by some immense, furious creature. "Out!" one of the guards grunted. She stepped onto the muddy ground, her thin shoes sinking into the cold earth. The guards deposited a small crate of supplies by the massive iron-bound door, and then, without another word, climbed back into their carriage. They were leaving. They were actually leaving her here, alone. The carriage rumbled away, its sound swallowed by the oppressive silence of the mountains. The silence was then broken by a new sound, a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate from the very stones of the keep. The great door groaned open, a sliver of darkness widening into a gaping maw. A figure emerged, and Seraphina's heart stopped. He was impossibly large, his frame filling the doorway. He was not a full wolf, but a man twisted into something more feral. His face was a roadmap of jagged, puckered scars, one side pulled so tight that his lip was permanently curled into a snarl. A long, deep scar sliced down through his left eye, which was clouded and milky white. His other eye, a startling, piercing gold, fixed on her with an intensity that felt like a physical blow. He was the beast of the crags, and she was his tribute. Draven watched the pathetic creature tremble before him. She was small, thin, her gray dress making her look like a wisp of smoke about to be blown away by the mountain wind. The regent's tribute. He'd expected a warrior sent to test him, or a cowering servant who would last a week before her mind snapped from fear. This girl looked like she would shatter if he so much as breathed on her. He felt the familiar thrum of the curse under his skin, a constant, agonizing fire that the scars only partially concealed. The pain was a living entity, his constant companion in this stone prison. It made him irritable, savage. It was what kept everyone away, just as Cassian intended. "You are the one they sent?" His voice was a rasp, torn and roughened by disuse, and the permanent damage to his throat from the witch's fire that had cursed him. The girl flinched but lifted her chin. Her eyes, the color of moss after a storm, held a flicker of something other than terror. Defiance. It was foolish, suicidal, and yet, it intrigued him. No one had looked at him with anything but fear or disgust for 5 years. "I am Seraphina," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but clear. He grunted, turning his back on her and stalking back into the keep's cavernous main hall. "Do not get in my way. Do not touch my things. There is a room at the top of the east tower. It will be yours. Food is in the crate. Ration it. The next delivery is in a month." His tone was a dismissal, a clear indication that her existence was an inconvenience he was forced to tolerate. The hall was vast and cold, thick with the dust of neglect. Most of the furniture was draped in white cloths, like ghosts asleep in a forgotten ballroom. The only signs of life were a massive hearth, where a low fire crackled, and a collection of worn books and maps on a large oak table. He expected her to scurry away to her room, to hide from him as any sane person would. But she didn't. She followed him into the hall, her footsteps hesitant but determined. "What am I to do here?" she asked. "Lord Cassian said you required a keeper." Draven let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded like rocks grinding together. "The regent has a flair for poetics. I require nothing. You are here because my dear uncle wishes to remind the world that a monster lives on his northern border. You are a prop in his little play." He sank into a large, throne-like chair by the fire, the movement stiff and pained. The curse was always worse when the cold settled deep into his bones. He closed his good eye, willing the throb behind his scarred one to subside. Seraphina watched him, her fear warring with a strange, burgeoning curiosity. This was not the mindless, slavering beast of the stories. He was wounded. The air around him was thick with a pain so profound it was almost a physical presence. She could feel it like a low hum against her skin, a familiar sensation she'd felt from others, but never with this crushing intensity. She said nothing more, retreating to find her room. The east tower was as cold and desolate as the rest of the keep. The room was sparse, containing only a hard-looking cot, a small table, and a window slit that looked out over a sheer drop. It was a cell, but it was also a space away from his piercing golden eye. The first few days passed in a tense, suffocating silence. Seraphina cleaned her small room, explored the parts of the castle that didn't feel forbidden, and carefully rationed the meager supplies. She saw the beast. She couldn't bring herself to think of him by any other name, only occasionally. He was a creature of shadow and solitude, often found brooding by the fire or staring out at the unforgiving landscape from a high battlement. He never spoke to her again after that first day. He simply existed, a looming, painful presence in the periphery of her life. Yet, she found herself watching him. She saw the way his hand sometimes clenched into a fist, his knuckles white, as if trying to crush an invisible foe. She noticed the slight limp in his gait that he tried so hard to conceal. She heard, sometimes late at night, a low groan of pain from his chambers in the main wing, a sound so full of agony it made her own body ache in sympathy. The stories were wrong. He wasn't just a monster. He was a man in constant torment. One evening, a week into her imprisonment, a storm raged outside, throwing sheets of icy rain against the stone walls. The fire in the great hall sputtered, providing little warmth against the damp chill. Seraphina was huddled in a corner, trying to read one of the books she'd found in the library, a collection of old myths, when a sharp guttural cry of pain echoed from the beast's chair. Her head snapped up. He was hunched over, his massive shoulders shaking. His head was clutched in his hands, and a low, continuous growl of pure misery rumbled in his chest. The scars on his face seemed darker, almost black, in the firelight. Fear told her to run, to hide, to lock herself in her tower room until it was over. But something else, something deeper, moved her feet. It was the same instinct that made her lay her hands on a feverish child or a wounded animal. It was her curse, her gift, her very nature. She approached him slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Are you all right?" The question was absurd. He was clearly in agony. He didn't look up. "Go away," he snarled, his voice thick with pain. She didn't. She stopped just beside his chair, her hands hovering in the air, uncertain. The waves of pain rolling off him were overwhelming, making her feel dizzy. She had never felt anything this powerful before. "Let me help," she whispered, the words leaving her lips before she could think. He finally looked up, his one good eye blazing with a mixture of fury and shock. "Help? What could a thing like you do? Leave me." His rejection was a physical blow, but the raw desperation in his eye held her rooted to the spot. He was drowning, and he was trying to claw her away even as he sank. Ignoring his command, ignoring the frantic screaming of her own survival instincts, she did the one thing she knew how to do. She reached out and gently placed her hand on his shoulder. The moment Serafina's hand touched his shoulder, a jolt, white-hot and stunning, shot through Draven's entire body. It was not the fire of the curse, but something else entirely. It was warmth. A clean, pure heat that did not burn but soothed, sinking through his tunic, through his skin, and directly into the heart of his pain. The agonizing thrumming that was the constant soundtrack to his existence lessened, the sharpest edges blurring into a dull, manageable ache. For the first time in 5 years, he could draw a full breath without feeling like his lungs were lined with broken glass. He jerked back by instinct, his chair scraping against the stone floor. The relief vanished as soon as her hand left him, and the pain rushed back in, vengeful and biting. He stared at her, his mind reeling. His golden eye was wide with disbelief, the snarl on his scarred face slackening into an expression of pure shock. "What? What did you do?" he rasped. Serafina's own heart was pounding. She had felt it too. A powerful connection, a torrent of his pain flowing into her, but instead of overwhelming her, it felt familiar, like a river finding its course. The warmth in her hands had flared to life, stronger than it had ever been. "I don't know," she answered honestly, her hand still tingling. "It's something I can do. I can soothe pain." He looked at her small, plain hands as if they were weapons. The pack had told him nothing about her, only that she was an Omega tribute. They had failed to mention she was some kind of healer, or a witch. His uncle had warned him of witches. It was a witch who had laid this curse upon him. But a witch's magic felt like cold rot and decay. This had felt like sunshine. Suspicion and a desperate, burgeoning hope warred within him. "Do it again," he commanded, his voice tight. She hesitated for only a second before stepping closer. This time, she placed her palm flat against the heavily scarred side of his face. The skin was rough and tight, a ruin of flesh. He flinched, expecting revulsion, but her touch was firm and steady. The warmth flooded him again, more potent this time. It pooled in the ravaged nerves of his face, silencing the screaming agony that had been his constant companion since the attack. The world, which he usually perceived through a haze of pain, sharpened into focus. He could smell the wood smoke from the fire, the scent of old paper from the books, the faint, clean scent of rain that clung to her. He could see the flecks of green and gold in her wide, uncertain eyes. He didn't realize he had closed his good eye until he felt a tear escape and trace a path through the grime on his unscarred cheek. The relief was so profound, so absolute, it was devastating. Serafina felt the shift in him. The rigid, coiled tension in his muscles eased. The tormented energy that radiated from him softened into something quieter, something akin to weary gratitude. She kept her hand there, channeling the warmth until her own energy began to wane and a tremor started in her arm. When she finally pulled back, the silence in the hall was different. It was no longer heavy and oppressive, but filled with a fragile, unspoken understanding. "Who are you?" he asked again, his voice softer this time, less of a growl. "I told you. I am Serafina, from the Silver Moon Pack." "They cast you out," he stated. It wasn't a question. "A healer of your power? They should have revered you." A bitter smile touched her lips. "They don't see it as healing. They see it as strange, unnatural. I am wolfless, an omega." My touch was a freakish trait on an already flawed creature. It made them uncomfortable. He stared into the fire, the new clarity allowing him to process the injustice of it. They had discarded a treasure because they were too ignorant to recognize its value. It was the way of the world he had once ruled, a world obsessed with brute strength and perfect forms, a world that would have no place for him now either. "The scars," she began, her voice hesitant. "Are they from a fire?" He tensed, the pain flaring slightly as his defenses rose. "They are from a curse," he said flatly. "A reminder of a battle I lost." He would say no more. Trust was a currency he no longer possessed. But this girl, she had given him a moment of peace, a gift more precious than any crown. From that night on, a new routine was established. Every evening after their silent meal, she would come to him by the fire. She would place her hands on his shoulders, his temples, or the gnarled, scarred flesh of his back. She would draw out the pain, quieting the curse that raged within him, and for an hour or two, he would know something close to peace. He started talking to her, not about his past, not about the curse, but about the books he read. He told her of ancient shifter lines, of celestial alignments and forgotten histories. He discovered she was not just a healer, but intelligent and quick-witted, with a quiet strength he was beginning to admire. She, in turn, began to see past the terrifying visage of the beast. She saw Draven. She had not learned his name, he had not offered it, but she had named him that in the privacy of her own mind. He was no longer a monster, but a man trapped in a prison of flesh and stone. She saw the keen intelligence in his one good eye, the sorrow that lined his mouth when he thought she wasn't looking, and the deep, abiding loneliness that echoed her own. One afternoon, she found him in the armory, practicing with a massive broadsword. He moved with a brutal, desperate grace, each swing a roar of defiance against his own body. He was favoring his left leg, and she could see the lines of pain etched on his face despite the exertion. "You'll injure yourself further," she said from the doorway. He stopped, breathing heavily. "It is necessary. My strength is the only thing that keeps the curse from consuming me entirely." "There are other kinds of strength," she replied quietly. He lowered the sword, turning to face her. The afternoon light streaming through the high window caught the golden flecks in his eye. "My uncle, the regent, will soon send his inspectors," he said, his tone grim. "They come every few months to ensure I am still feral, still contained. They must not see you like this with me. They must not know you can help." The implication was clear. Her ability was a threat to the narrative Cassian had built around him. If the beast was not in constant agony, he might be less of a monster. He might be manageable, controllable, or worse, curable. And that, Draven knew, was the one thing his uncle could not allow. The arrival of the regent's men was heralded by the crunch of boots on the gravel path a week later. Draven felt their approach long before they were visible, a familiar tightening in his gut that had nothing to do with the curse. He immediately retreated into the persona of the beast, his posture hunching, a low growl building in his throat. "Go to your tower," he commanded Seraphina, his voice once again the harsh rasp she'd first heard. "Do not come out. Do not make a sound." She saw the change in him, the deliberate extinguishing of the light she had come to recognize in his eye. The man she shared stories with was gone, replaced by the monster from the legends. It was a chillingly effective performance. She nodded, her heart heavy with a fear that was now for him, not of him, and fled up the winding stairs. From the narrow window slit in her room, she watched as 3 men in the regent's black and silver livery dismounted. 2 were hulking warriors, their hands resting on the pommels of their swords. The third, their leader, was a slender man with a cruel twist to his lips named Malachi. He was Cassian's most trusted enforcer. Draven met them at the great door, filling the frame with his intimidating bulk. He let out a roar, a sound of pure, untamed fury that echoed off the mountains. It was the sound she had heard in her nightmares, but now she knew it for what it was: a shield. "The regent sends his regards, beast," Malachi called out, his voice laced with mocking condescension. He did not flinch at the display of aggression. "He wishes to ensure his northern guard is still vigilant." Draven responded with another snarl, baring his teeth. One of the guards took an involuntary step back. "He seems well," Malachi observed with a smirk. "And the tribute? Is she still in one piece? Or has she made for a decent meal?" The casual cruelty of the question made Seraphina's blood run cold. They saw her as nothing more than disposable. "She lives," Draven growled, the words sounding like they were torn from his throat. "She is a nuisance." "Excellent. We've brought fresh supplies. The regent is most generous." Malachi gestured for the guards to unload a crate, identical to the one Seraphina had arrived with. They were not here for inspection. They were here to reinforce his isolation, to remind him of his place. The encounter was brief. Malachi asked a few more goading questions, which Draven answered with guttural threats. Satisfied that the beast was still a broken, savage thing, the men departed. Seraphina watched them ride away until they were specks in the distance, her hands clenched into fists. When she came down from the tower, she found Draven slumped in his chair by the fire, his body trembling with the aftershock of his performance. The act of summoning that much rage, of deliberately stoking the fires of his own curse, had taken a terrible toll. The pain was etched deeply into his features, his good eye squeezed shut. She went to him without a word and placed her hands on his temples. The heat that met her was scorching, the pain a living, violent thing. She poured her own calm and quiet strength into him, a gentle tide against his raging inferno. It took longer this time, but slowly the tremors subsided and the rigid lines of his body softened. He opened his eye, and the gratitude in it was so profound it stole her breath. "Thank you," he murmured. "They are cruel," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "They enjoy your suffering." "It is what keeps my uncle in power," Draven said, his voice weary. "As long as the kingdom believes the true Alpha King's heir is a mindless monster, no one will challenge his regency. No one will rally to my banner." The word hung in the air between them. King. She had suspected, of course. The way he spoke of history and politics, the inherent authority in his bearing even when he was in agony. But to hear it confirmed sent a shock through her. She was living with the lost Alpha King. Then we must find a way to break the curse, she declared, a sudden fierce resolve hardening her voice. He looked at her, a sad smile twisting his scarred lips. It is blood magic of the darkest kind, Seraphina, woven with iron and fire and deceit. The witch who cast it said only a balm of absolute sacrifice could undo it. I do not even know what that means. Then we will find out, she insisted. Their relationship deepened in the weeks that followed. They spent hours in the keep's ancient library, poring over forgotten texts, searching for any mention of curses like his. He taught her to read the old runes, and she, in turn, discovered she had a knack for finding patterns in the arcane symbols. He began to trust her, not just with his pain, but with pieces of his past. He told her of his father, the former king, a just and kind ruler. He spoke of his own training, of the life he'd been meant to lead before he was ambushed during a diplomatic mission, attacked by the witch and her minions. He spoke of the betrayal he suspected but could not prove, that his own uncle had orchestrated the attack to seize the throne. Seraphina, in turn, shared the small, painful stories of her own life, the constant shame of being wolfless, the sting of her family's disappointment, the crushing loneliness of being an outcast. In the shadow of the cursed king, the wolfless Omega found someone who finally saw her, not as a defect, but as a person of worth. The physical space between them shrank as well. She no longer hesitated to touch him, and he no longer flinched away. Her healing became a familiar comfort, a ritual of intimacy that transcended words. Sometimes, when the pain was gone and a quiet peace settled over them, he would rest his head back, and she would gently trace the lines of his less severe scars, a silent act of acceptance. One night, as a blizzard howled outside, they sat before the fire, a heavy tome of lore open between them. Seraphina was reading aloud, her voice a soft melody in the quiet hall, when she stumbled upon a passage. "The curse of the scorched soul," she read, her breath catching. "Forged in dragon's breath and a traitor's blood, can only be unmade when the cursed is embraced by his fated heart, a soul who sees the man and not the monster, and is willing to shield him from the killing blow." She trailed off, her eyes wide. Draven looked at the text, then at her. His fated heart. The old words for a true mate. The pull he felt towards her. The inexplicable sense of rightness when she was near. The way her touch was the only thing that could soothe him. It all coalesced into a stunning, terrifying realization. The moon goddess, in her infinite cruelty and wisdom, had sent him his mate in the form of this small, wolfless Omega. The one person who could save him was the one person he was destined to endanger. Before he could speak, a sharp metallic clang echoed from the courtyard. It was not the sound of wind or snow. It was the sound of armor. Draven was on his feet in an instant, his body tense. "They're back," he growled. "But it is not the time for an inspection." He moved to the arrow slit beside the door, peering into the swirling snow. A half-dozen figures were advancing on the keep, their movements stealthy and professional. These were not inspectors. They were assassins. Malachi was among them, a long, black-bladed dagger in his hand. "They know," Draven whispered, a cold dread washing over him. "Somehow, Cassian knows you are healing me." He sent them to finish the job. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Seraphina. They were trapped. The keep, once her prison, had become a fragile sanctuary, and now it was about to be breached. "What do we do?" she breathed, her eyes fixed on Draven's broad, tense back. "You hide," he commanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He was already moving, strapping on leather vambraces from a chest near the door. The king was asserting himself over the beast. "The library. There's a hidden passage behind the far bookshelf. It leads down to the lower cellars. Go, now." "I will not leave you," she said, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed. The thought of abandoning him to face those men alone was unbearable. He whirled on her, his golden eye blazing with a desperate fire. "Seraphina, this is not a request. They are not here for me. They are here for you. You are the variable my uncle did not anticipate. If they kill you, I remain his broken puppet forever. Your life is the only hope I have left. Now go." His words, filled with a raw, protective urgency, struck her more forcefully than any physical blow. He wasn't pushing her away to protect himself. He was pushing her away to protect his one chance at salvation, which he now equated with her survival. Tears pricked her eyes, but she nodded, turned, and ran. She fled through the great hall, her soft shoes slapping against the cold stone, and into the dusty silence of the library. She found the bookshelf he'd described, her hands fumbling along the spines of ancient books until she felt a loose one. She pressed it, and with a low groan of grinding stone, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow passage. She cast one last look back towards the hall, her heart aching. Then she slipped into the darkness, pulling the heavy stone door shut behind her. Draven listened until the sound of the secret door closing echoed faintly in the hall. Only then did he draw the massive broadsword from its scabbard. The blade was old, but its edge was keen. He took his position in the center of the room, a lone, scarred sentinel awaiting the storm. The main door burst inward with a splintering crash. Malachi and 5 elite assassins spilled into the room, fanning out, their weapons drawn. They were clad in dark leather, their faces grim. "The regent has grown tired of waiting for you to rot, beast," Malachi sneered, his black-bladed dagger held loosely in his hand. "He has decided to expedite the process, and to remove his little complication." Draven didn't answer. He let the rage build, but this time it was not a performance. It was a cold, focused fury. These men had come to harm Seraphina. They had threatened his mate. The curse flared within him, not as pain, but as power. He welcomed it. The first 2 assassins rushed him simultaneously from either side. Draven met them with a roar that was pure Alpha King. His broadsword became a blur of motion. He parried the first man's strike, the clang of steel ringing through the hall, and spun, using the momentum to cleave through the second man's guard, his blade biting deep. The man fell with a choked cry. Draven was a whirlwind of controlled violence. Despite his old injuries, despite the curse that sought to cripple him, he fought with the skill and instinct of a king born to battle. He was outnumbered, but in this hall, he was the apex predator. Meanwhile, in the suffocating darkness of the passage, Seraphina pressed her ear against the cold stone, listening to the sounds of the fight. The clash of swords, the grunts of exertion, the terrible wet sound of a mortal wound. Every sound sent a fresh wave of terror through her. She was safe, but he was up there fighting for her. For them. A sudden, sharp cry of pain echoed through the stone, Draven's voice. It was followed by Malachi's triumphant laugh. "The poison works quickly, doesn't it?" Malachi's voice was venomous, specially crafted by the same witch who gave you your pretty face. "It attacks the curse, turns your own dark magic against you. An exquisite agony, I'm told. Poison." Seraphina's blood ran cold. She could not just hide here and let him die. The passage in the book flashed in her mind. A soul who sees the man and not the monster, and is willing to shield him from the killing blow. She wasn't a warrior. She had no weapon. But she was not useless. She was a healer. And she was his mate. Her place was by his side. Making her choice, she pushed against the stone door. It was heavy, but adrenaline gave her strength. It swung open with a groan. She crept to the edge of the library doorway, peering into the great hall. The scene was horrifying. 3 assassins lay dead or dying on the floor. The remaining 2 were holding Draven at bay. He was on one knee, his broadsword held in a shaking grip. A dark, viscous fluid dripped from a wound in his side where Malachi's black dagger had struck him. His breathing was ragged, and the scars on his face were pulsing with a sickly green light. The poison was eating him alive from the inside out. "Where is the girl?" Malachi demanded, circling Draven like a hyena. "Give her to us, and the regent might allow you a quick death." "Never," Draven spat, blood flecking his lips. He tried to rise, but his legs buckled, and he collapsed onto his side with a groan, the great sword clattering from his grasp. As Malachi raised his poisoned dagger for the final strike, Seraphina acted. She ran from the library, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, and threw herself in front of Draven's fallen body, shielding him with her own. "No!" she screamed, her arms spread wide. Malachi stopped, his eyes widening in surprise and then narrowing in cruel amusement. "Ah, the little Omega. You've saved me the trouble of hunting you down. Step aside. You will not touch him," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Foolish girl. You're choosing to die with him?" He lunged, not at her, but over her, aiming the dagger at Draven's exposed throat. In that split second, Seraphina did the only thing she could. She grabbed Malachi's descending arm with both hands. The moment her skin touched his, she didn't try to push. She poured every ounce of her being, every bit of her healing warmth, not into Malachi, but into the dagger he held. She focused on the poison coating the blade, on its vile, corrupting magic. A blinding white light erupted from her hands. Malachi screamed as the dagger glowed red-hot, the dark magic infusing it, turning back on him. The weapon melted in his grasp, searing his flesh. He stumbled back, howling in agony, clutching his burned and ruined hand. The 2 remaining assassins stared in shock, momentarily stunned by the display of power. It was the opening Draven needed. With a final desperate surge of strength, he reached for his sword, rolled, and swept the blade in a low arc, cutting both men down at the knees. The hall fell silent, save for Malachi's whimpering and Draven's labored breaths. Seraphina scrambled to Draven's side. The green light was still pulsing from his wound, the poison relentlessly doing its work. "Draven!" she cried, her hands hovering over the gash. He looked at her, his golden eye clouded with pain, but filled with a fierce, desperate love. "Sirrah," he rasped. "I can help you," she said, pressing her hands firmly against the wound. She closed her eyes and focused, drawing on a depth of power she had never touched before. She pulled the poison, the corrupt magic, out of him and into herself. It was agony. It felt like swallowing fire and ice, a vile corruption that sought to shred her from the inside. But she held on, anchored by the feel of his heartbeat under her palms. As she drew the last of the poison into her own body, the world began to spin. Black spots danced in her vision. The last thing she saw before consciousness failed her was Draven's scarred face, his expression one of pure terror as he called her name. Then, everything went dark. Draven watched in horror as Seraphina collapsed, her body going limp beside him. The poison was gone from his wound, the sickly green light fading, but he could feel the taint of it now clinging to her. She had taken it into herself. She had sacrificed herself for him. A balm of absolute sacrifice. The witch's words echoed in his mind. A roar of pure, unadulterated rage tore from his throat. It was the sound of a king, a beast, a mate whose other half was dying. He surged to his feet, the weakness from the poison forgotten, replaced by a strength born of fury and despair. He stalked over to the whimpering Malachi, who was cradling his burned hand. Draven hauled the assassin to his feet by the front of his tunic. "This was for nothing," he snarled, his face inches from Malachi's terrified one. "Tell my uncle his time is over." He threw the man towards the broken doors. "Go. Run back to your master. Tell him the beast of the crags is dead, and the Alpha King is coming for his throne." Malachi scrambled to his feet and fled into the blizzard, a messenger carrying his own death warrant. Draven knew his uncle would not suffer the failure to return. Then he was back at Seraphina's side, gathering her gently into his arms. She was terrifyingly still, her skin cold and pale. Her breathing was shallow, a faint flutter against his chest. He carried her to the large fur rugs before the hearth, laying her down as if she were made of spun glass. He ripped a strip of cloth from his tunic and pressed it to the wound in his side, his own injury a distant, unimportant thing. All that mattered was her. He knelt beside her, his large, scarred hand stroking her hair. The warmth that had always flowed from her was gone. Her skin was like ice. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I will not lose you. Not after just finding you." He tried to push his own energy into her, the raw power of his alpha bloodline, but it was like trying to fill a sieve. The dark magic she had absorbed was consuming her from within. He was a king, a warrior, a beast of immense power, and he was utterly helpless. He thought of the passage from the book, embraced by his fated heart, a soul who sees the man and not the monster. She had done that. She had seen him, truly seen him, from the very beginning, and is willing to shield him from the killing blow. She had done that too. She had fulfilled her part of the prophecy. Now it was his turn. But how? How could he embrace her, save her, when he was still trapped in this cursed form? As he looked at her still face, a profound shift occurred within him. For 5 years he had hated the curse. He had fought it, raged against it, seen it as his enemy. But it was a part of him. The scars, the pain, the monstrosity. It was all part of the man she had come to care for. She had not loved the king he once was, or the king he might one day be. She had accepted the broken creature he was now. And in that moment of absolute acceptance of himself, something broke free. He stopped fighting the curse and instead embraced it, claimed it as his own. He let the pain and the darkness flow through him, not as a poison, but as a part of his own story, his own strength. He leaned over Seraphina, his heart aching with a love so fierce it was a physical pain. "I see you too, Seraphina," he murmured, his lips brushing her forehead. "My brave, wolfless Omega, my healer, my queen." He lowered his head and pressed his mouth to hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of desperation and surrender. He poured all of his love, all of his acceptance, all of his newly claimed self into that single touch. A brilliant golden light exploded from their point of contact, engulfing them both. It was not the harsh, angry light of the curse, but a warm, healing radiance. Draven felt a searing agony as the light tore through him, but this time it was a purifying fire. It burned away the witch's dark magic, unraveling the threads of the curse one by one. The puckered, ruined flesh of his face smoothed and healed. The milky film over his left eye dissolved, revealing a second golden eye, identical to its twin. The scars that had crisscrossed his body for 5 long years vanished like smoke, leaving clean, unblemished skin behind. His very posture changed, the hunched, pained frame of the beast straightening into the tall, powerful, and regal stature of the Alpha King. The light faded, leaving him kneeling over her, whole and restored. His true face, the one he hadn't seen in half a decade, was strong and handsome, marked only by the gravity of what he had endured. He looked down at Seraphina. The light had healed her, too. The poison she had absorbed was purged, banished by the same power that had broken his curse. Color was returning to her cheeks, and her breathing deepened, becoming steady and even. Her eyelids fluttered open, her moss-green eyes, no longer clouded with fear or pain, widened as she looked up at him. She was seeing him for the first time, the real him, the man without the scars. A slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. "Draven," she whispered, saying his name for the first time, though he had never told it to her. She had known it all along, in her heart. "My Seraphina," he said, his voice no longer a rasp, but a clear, deep baritone. He lowered his head again, and this time he kissed her with all the passion and promise of their new beginning. At that moment, the great doors of the keep swung open again. A large, grim-faced wolf with a silver-gray pelt stood there, flanked by a dozen warriors. It was Gideon, Draven's most loyal beta and friend, who had been secretly searching for a way to help his king for years. He had finally tracked the assassins. Gideon's eyes widened, first at the carnage in the hall, and then at the man kneeling by the fire. He stared, his jaw slack, at the unscarred face of his long-lost friend and king. "Draven," he breathed, his voice filled with awe. "By the goddess, it's you." Draven looked up, a king's authority settling on him as naturally as a cloak. "It is, old friend," he said, helping Seraphina to her feet. He kept her tucked securely against his side. "The regent's reign is over. It's time to go home." The return to the capital city of Silverwood was not the triumphant procession Draven might have once imagined. It was a swift, silent journey, a blade slicing through the heart of the kingdom towards his uncle. Gideon and his warriors formed a protective vanguard, their expressions a mixture of grim determination and pure awe. They rode through the night, the news of the king's return a secret they guarded with their lives. Seraphina rode with Draven on his massive war horse, wrapped in his cloak and held securely before him. The change in him was more than skin deep. The oppressive aura of pain that had always surrounded him was gone, replaced by a calm, formidable power that seemed to hum in the very air. He was every inch the Alpha King, yet when he looked at her, his golden eyes held the same tenderness and gratitude she had seen in the beast. They arrived at the royal citadel at dawn, using secret passages known only to Gideon and the royal line to bypass the main gates. They emerged into the throne room, a place of cold, austere grandeur that reflected Cassian's rule. Lord Cassian was there, holding court, his silver armor gleaming. He was in the middle of sentencing a minor lord for some perceived slight when the doors to the king's private entrance slammed open. Every head in the room turned. Draven strode in, Seraphina at his side, with Gideon and the royal guard fanning out behind him. A collective gasp swept through the court. They saw not the scarred monster of rumor, but a powerful alpha in his prime, his face unblemished, his eyes burning with righteous fury. He was the spitting image of his beloved father. He was their true king. Cassian's face went white with shock, his composure shattering. He stared at Draven, his mind clearly unable to process what he was seeing. "You," he stammered. "It's not possible." "The curse." "The curse is broken, Uncle," Draven said, his voice ringing with authority, silencing the frantic murmurs of the court. "As is your illegal and treacherous reign." He looked at Seraphina, his expression softening for a moment. "It was broken by the courage and sacrifice of this woman. The Omega your cruelty discarded, the mate you sent to a monster's den, hoping she would be devoured." He raised her hand, their fingers lacing together. "Let it be known by all here today. This is Seraphina of the Silver Moon Pack, my fated mate, your queen." Another wave of shock rippled through the assembled lords and ladies. An Omega? A wolfless one, at that? As their queen? It was unheard of. But no one dared voice their dissent, not in the face of the sheer power radiating from their returned king. Cassian, seeing his power crumbling, made a last desperate move. "Lies!" he shrieked, drawing his sword. "He is an impostor! A demon in the king's skin. Guards, seize him." The Citadel guards hesitated, their loyalty torn. But Gideon and his men were faster. They formed a wall of steel in front of their king. "You have no power here, Cassian," Draven said calmly, not even bothering to draw his own weapon. "Your treachery is at an end." He nodded to Gideon. Cassian was swiftly, unceremoniously disarmed and seized. His face, once a mask of arrogant control, was now twisted with hate and disbelief. "You will not get away with this," he hissed as he was dragged away. "The witch will see you burn again." Draven ignored him, his attention focused solely on the court before him. "There will be a time for justice," he announced. "A time for rebuilding. But first, there will be a change. For too long, this kingdom has valued only brute strength. We have discarded those we deemed weak, those who were different. We have measured worth by the sharpness of a claw, not the strength of a heart." His gaze swept over the stunned faces. "My queen," he said, his voice ringing with pride, "healed me with a power you would have called a flaw. Her empathy is a greater strength than any sword, her compassion, a truer shield than any armor. Under our rule, that will be the new law of this land. Worth will be measured by character, not by title or form. The age of fear is over. A new age of hope begins today." He then turned to Seraphina, and in front of the entire court he knelt on one knee. He took her hand and pressed it to his lips. "You saved my life, my love. You saved my soul. Will you stand beside me and help me save our people?" Tears streamed down Seraphina's face, tears not of sorrow or fear, but of overwhelming joy and a sense of belonging so profound it healed every old wound in her heart. The wolfless Omega, the useless tribute, the girl who was worth nothing, was being asked to rule a kingdom. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "always." He rose and, in a gesture that sealed their bond and their reign, he lowered his head and marked her, his teeth sinking gently into the crook of her neck. A jolt of pure energy, of completion shot through her. In that moment, something deep inside her, something long dormant and silent, awakened with a joyful howl. Her wolf, healed and whole, stirred to life by the love of her mate. The court stood in stunned silence for a moment, and then, one by one, the lords and ladies knelt. Not in fear of a tyrant, but in genuine reverence for the king who had returned from the darkness, and the quiet Omega Queen who had led him back into the light. 1 year later, the throne room was transformed. The cold, austere stone was now warmed by rich tapestries depicting not battles, but scenes of harvest and community. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating a court that was no longer filled with fear and suspicion, but with a vibrant, hopeful energy. King Draven stood beside the throne, watching his kingdom with pride. The changes he and Seraphina had instituted had been slow but profound. Omega rights were protected by royal decree. New training academies were established that valued healers, scholars, and artisans as much as warriors. The rigid hierarchy of the packs was beginning to soften, replaced by a culture that was learning to value empathy and cooperation. But his greatest pride was the woman who stood beside him, her hand resting on her gently rounded stomach. Queen Seraphina had blossomed. She was no longer the timid, silent girl from the Omega dens. She was a confident and beloved ruler, her quiet wisdom and compassionate counsel sought by lords and commoners alike. Her wolf, a beautiful creature with a coat the color of rich earth, was now her constant companion, a symbol of her own journey from brokenness to wholeness. She turned to him, a loving smile on her face. "You're brooding," she teased gently. "Is the King of Silverwood troubled by matters of state?" He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close and resting his hand over hers on their unborn child. "No," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "The King of Silverwood is counting his blessings, and he has lost count." The pain of his past was a distant memory, a scar on his soul that she had completely healed. He was no longer the beast, nor was he simply the king. He was Draven, a husband and a soon-to-be father, a man made whole by a love he never thought he deserved. A young pup, the daughter of a visiting alpha, toddled towards them, tripping over her own feet. Before she could fall, Seraphina knelt down, her movements graceful despite her pregnancy, and caught the child. The pup had scraped her knee, and her face was crumpled, ready to cry. Seraphina simply placed her hand over the small scrape. A gentle, warm light glowed from her palm for a moment. The pup's tears vanished, replaced by a look of wide-eyed wonder. She giggled and ran back to her mother. The court watched, not with suspicion as her old pack once had, but with reverence and affection. Her gift, once a source of shame, was now a celebrated symbol of their queen's kindness. Later that evening, they stood on their private balcony, overlooking the sleeping city. The moon was full, casting a silver glow over the world. "Do you ever miss the keep?" Seraphina asked softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. Draven considered it. He thought of the cold stone, the isolation, the constant pain. But he also thought of the quiet evenings by the fire, the discovery of a shared soul in the most desolate of places. "I do not miss the prison," he said, his voice a low rumble, "but I will forever be grateful for what I found there." He turned her to face him, his golden eyes filled with a love that was as vast and constant as the night sky. "I found my entire world in a crumbling tower. I found you." She smiled, her heart full. "And I found that monsters are just kings in disguise, waiting for someone to see past their scars." He kissed her then, a long, slow kiss filled with the promise of 1,000 more nights like this one. They were no longer the cursed king and the rejected Omega. They were the architects of a new age, a king and queen bound not just by fate, but by a love that had been forged in darkness and had brought forth an everlasting light. And as their child kicked gently within her, they knew their greatest story was still just beginning.